The Old Kingdom has fallen, and the First Intermediate Period has begun. A combination of factors, including the weakening of royal power at the expense of the local nomarchs, a period of verification, and the death of the ruler leading to a succession crisis, led to the collapse of the central administration in Memphis. The First Intermediate Period ultimately serves as a period of transition between the Old and Middle Kingdoms. It extends for roughly 150 years, and it contains the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th dynasties, as well as a portion of the 11th. The period itself can be divided into three separate phases. The first is an era in which the regime of the Old Kingdom rapidly decomposes. It's marked by apparent social unrest and maybe foreign invasions. It covers the 7th and 8th dynasties and only lasts about 20 years. The capital is still Memphis. The second phase is marked by the Heracleopolitan kings. The nomarchs of Heracleopolis overwhelm the weakened center power in Memphis and become the 9th and 10th dynasties of Egypt. There is a very short period of tranquility before the internal struggles begin again, as the nomes that have remained independent fight among themselves. Some of them recognize the authority of Heracleopolis, while others recognize the authority of Thebes. The third and last phase of the period lies in the establishment of the 11th dynasty, who rule in the previously mentioned city of Thebes. After managing to wrest control over Upper Egypt, they eliminate their rival power in the north and bring Egypt together, once again, under a single crown, keeping Thebes as their capital. It's unquestionable that the First Intermediate Period was marked by political instability. The kings and the ruling class no longer had the access to the same resources as they did during the Old Kingdom. While compositions and inscriptions found on tombs regarding this period, both contemporary and later during the Middle Kingdom, are rather pessimistic, it's unclear how truthful they are. A noticeable trend in historiography exists, where older historical works on this period tend to take these events at face value, while modern scholarship is far more critical and doubtful of their veracity. The 7th dynasty of Egypt is widely regarded by Egyptologists to be spurious. That is, it didn't exist. Certainly not in the way in which the Egyptian historian Manetho presents it. As he stated, there were 70 kings in the space of 70 days, ruling from Memphis. Among the many historians who follow this view is the Egyptologist Toby Wilkinson. However, recently, this was challenged by the Egyptologist Hratch Papazian, who proposed that a number of rulers, which were attributed by the Abydos king list to the 8th dynasty, belonged in truth to the 7th. Any supposed events which have occurred during this period are only described by a piece of document that is highly dubious in its validity. The Ipuwer Papyrus contains a text known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer, meant to describe the turbulent times of the First Intermediate Period. However, it is not a contemporary text. It was written no earlier than the 12th dynasty, and today, this document is considered to be propaganda. The text itself has no apparent logic and is full of contradictions, but it does paint a picture of a kingdom that had fallen into chaos. It tells whoever reads it that nomadic peoples invaded Egypt and occupied the Delta. Royal power is no longer in any condition to send expeditions into lands beyond in both Asia and Africa, these being expedient towards the general prosperity for the country. The text further indicates that the cause for this weakening of royal power appears to have been social unrest. The text describes several occurrences in which the royal administration becomes unable to do its function, as the general population kills the crown's public servants and consistently sabotages their work. These violent anti-government acts are accompanied by a social subversion. The poor, for a lack of a better term, steal from the rich. Buildings go up in flames. Servants surround themselves in jewelry, and housewives lament the lack of food. The text is, however, contradictory in nature. Sometimes it affirms the king is at the complete mercy of the populace, as he is kidnapped by them, and his treasury is looted. At other times, the text expresses as if the king is still all-powerful within the country. As previously said, today, the admonitions of Ipuwer are regarded as propaganda, and it wouldn't be the only text of such nature, as it is inspired by a likely earlier work from the same 12th dynasty, the Prophecy of Neferti. This particular piece brings us back to the reign of Sneferu of the 4th dynasty, where it is supposedly predicted that the downfall of Egypt would come through civil war, followed by the eventual atonement of the nation through the rise of a great king who would lead Egypt back into peace and prosperity. The admonitions of Ipuwer also speak of foreign invasion. However, given the fact that this document is not contemporary with the period and widely regarded as propaganda, there is a degree of doubt if Egypt was truly invaded. A few of the works from Egyptologists on the First Intermediate Period, particularly some of the more recent ones, do not speak of foreign invasions, perhaps because this widely regarded as a piece of propaganda is one of the few documents which speaks of such an event. Another document which names this event, called the Teaching for King Merikare, is effectively a treatise on kingship in the form of a royal testament, which still mentions supposed events occurring during the First Intermediate Period, where it would seem the king Keti III had pacified the Delta, defeating Asiatic Bedouins. However, this is a literary composition likely written during the Middle Kingdom, not during the First Intermediate Period. So none of the two compositions are truly historical texts. While foreign invaders will be occasionally mentioned from now on, any mention must be taken with a grain of salt. The 8th dynasty isn't quite as obscure as the 7th, though it is short-lived, lasting only for 2, perhaps 3 decades. At this point, central power still resides in Memphis. One of the dynasty's kings, Kakabe Ibi, is attested by the presence of a pyramid discovered nearby the ruins of another, that one being of Pepi II, the last great ruler of the Old Kingdom. Today, this pyramid presents itself too as a ruin, but even when it was built, it was not comparable in the slightest to the great pyramids of the Giza necropolis, its base being close to 10 times smaller and its height being around 7 times shorter in comparison with the Great Pyramid of Giza. Recorded on the walls of the Temple of Coptos, a series of royal decrees attest plainly how far the power of the Egyptian monarchy has fallen, as the rulership of Memphis has to subject itself to procure alliances with the governors of Upper Egypt in order to stay in power. The Old Kingdom is already at this point a distant memory. It's possible that the Delta may be under the control of foreigners. The Thinite Nome where Abydos lies, as well as the Nome of Elephantine where the door to Nubia stands, are both independent. It's possible that the last kings of the 8th dynasty may have only controlled the exact middle of the traditional Egyptian kingdom built around the Nile Valley, stretching only from Memphis to Coptos. It's then that, by around 2100 BCE, the ruler of Heracleopolis revolts against the last king of Memphis and openly calls himself the ruler of both Upper and Lower Egypt. The nomarch in question is named Keti. It is with him that the 9th dynasty of Egypt begins. The city of Heracleopolis was called by the Egyptians as Henennesut, located a bit further south from Memphis. It had been, since the Thinite period, an important religious center where the ram god Herishaf was worshipped, though he was not the only ram god in Egypt. Located in one of the most fertile provinces of Middle Egypt, the nome was not only rich, but well protected from both the bellicose nomarchs of Thebes and Elephantine, as well as the foreign invaders presumed to have invaded the Delta during this period. The 9th dynasty has left us few monuments, and the major sources for it are still Manetho and the Turin king list. Unfortunately, the names of many of its kings are lost to us, and there's very little information about the dynasty. It would seem that this dynasty attempted to connect itself to the monarchical tradition of Memphis, as seen by the names of some of its pharaohs, such as Neferkare and Nebkaure. It's possible that while Heracleopolis was the pharaoh's residence, Memphis would have remained as the kingdom's administrative center. Even though we know very little of him, the first king appears to be the most well known. Egypt at large seems to have recognized his authority. Kheti I, called Actos by Manetho, behaved more cruelly than his predecessors and brought suffering to all of Egypt, before succumbing to madness and being eaten by a crocodile. At least, that's what Manetho says of him. Eventually, the dynasty becomes extinguished. The 10th dynasty follows, still residing in Heracleopolis. According to Manetho, this dynasty had 19 kings and lasted for 185 years, though the Cambridge Ancient History says in truth it only lasted about 90. And it is around this time that the nome of Thebes begins gaining relevance. Its nomarch, named Intef, consolidates power in Upper Egypt, creating a rift once again between North and South. The 11th dynasty was born. Sharing the same name as his ancestor, Intef I is the first king of this new dynasty, giving rise to Thebes as the dominant city of Egypt. Under the Old Kingdom, Thebes was constituted by two villages by the Nile, one which will be later known as Luxor, and the other Karnak. However, initially, the 11th dynasty did not control much land beyond the Theban region. Ever since the 8th dynasty, the nomarchs already had been effectively independent and only nominally recognized the royal power of Memphis. Each had their own army and treasury. Among the most powerful of the nomarchs, those of Coptos must be emphasized. A long-time ally of the Memphite kings, Coptos enjoyed many favorable decrees, most notably tax immunities, as displayed in the fragments known as the Coptos Decrees. Another notable nome is that of Asyut, located almost perfectly in the middle of Egypt. Its nomarchs were strong supporters of the Heracleopolitan kings. The conquest of their city would precede the final capitulation of Heracleopolis and the end of the civil war. Finally, the nomarchs of Oryx, located in Middle Egypt, who rose to prominence during this period. Initially neutral in the conflict between the two dynasties, they would eventually join the Thebans. In the south, the Thebans had to deal with their fair share of enemies, most notably the overlords of Hierakonpolis, who retained their role as overseers of Upper Egypt. Another notable enemy was the nome of Thinis, where Abydos also lies. It was from this territory where the unifiers of Egypt had come from. Thus, Thebes was forced to fight a number of southern nomes who formed a coalition against it. However, the Theban rulers triumphed, and they became the uncontested rulers of the south. And so, Egypt stands divided. The nomes of the south, stretching from Elephantine to Thinis, obey Thebes, while Middle Egypt at large recognizes the authority of Heracleopolis. North from Memphis, in the Delta, the situation is unclear. Perhaps it is overrun by Asiatic foreigners, Perhaps it is ruled by its own monarchs, perhaps it's a bit of both. The reigns of the kings of both the 10th and the 11th dynasties are occupied with the struggle for supremacy over Egypt. The city of Abydos more or less marks the division between the two coalitions. If the previously mentioned teaching for King Merikare is historically correct, then the 10th dynasty ruler Keti III seems to have temporarily controlled Abydos, but was forced to abandon it, and it would seem Heracleopolis accepts the current division of Egypt. In the same text, the king offers his advice to his eventual successor. The text contains clear allusions to the current political situation, as he cautions Merikare to not attack the south. This advice is followed by suggestions in relation to the north, where the king claims to have expelled the invaders and filled its nomes with people. He asks his son to follow the same policies, and so maintain peace with Thebes. Whether or not this text is historically accurate, any peace between North and South was short-lived. Eventually, the two kingdoms go to war again, and, just as in the pre-dynastic, the South will impose itself on the North. The last Heracleopolitan king is defeated, and the 10th dynasty is no more. The Theban king who conquers the north, Mentuhotep II, changes his royal titulary to Sematawi, meaning he who unifies the two lands. Just as the Thinite kings had once accomplished, the Theban dynasty re-establishes one single authority over all of Egypt. The first intermediate period is over. Thanks to the numerous texts written about this era, some contemporary, some after the first intermediate period, we can more or less piece together how Egypt reunified after the collapse of the Memphite royal power. If they formally recognized the ruler of Memphis as pharaoh, the nomarchs acted in practice independently of him. Petty struggles among nomes gradually transformed into large struggles between coalitions. Some nomes in the south, fearful of Thebes, did not hesitate to form an alliance with Heracleopolis. Others, more cautious, chose not to take sides, and thus were rewarded with a recognition of their rights when Thebes assumed power. Many texts reflect the political instability. It would seem that the presence of non-Egyptians in this conflict, likely used as mercenaries, were not uncommon, as the tomb of the Asyut nomarch Meseti contains depictions of Nubian archers alongside Egyptian spearmen. Slowly but surely, the coalition stabilized and were reduced to two, led by Heracleopolis and Thebes, until the southern powers' eventual victory. The texts of the first intermediate period consistently allude to famine and poverty. One of the most important texts from this period lies in the tomb of a nomarch of Nechen called Ankhtifi. There, one finds his own autobiography, which describes the degree of famine which swept Upper Egypt.
The south came with its people and the north with its children. They brought the finest oil in exchange for the barley which was given them. My barley went upstream until it reached Lower Nubia, and downstream until it reached the Abyddin nome. All of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger, and people were eating their children, but I did not allow anyone to die of hunger in this nome. The whole country has become like locusts, going upstream and downstream, but never did I allow anybody in need to go from this nome to another. I am the hero without equal.
Ankhtifi's boastful autobiography also speaks of his greatness.
I was the beginning and the end of mankind, since nobody like myself existed before, nor will he exist. Nobody like me was ever born, nor will he be born. I surpass the feats of my ancestors, and coming generations will not be able to equal me in any of my feats within this million of years.
He was not the only boastful nomarch of his era, but his autobiography does allude to how far the Egyptian monarchy had fallen. Furthermore, while he was not the only nomarch to claim to have ended hunger in his ruling province, the simple fact that this is considered a notable feat may indicate Egypt was undergoing a famine crisis, though this could also be an exaggeration. On their end, the Heracleopolitan kings had begun the reunification of Egypt by recovering the nomes of the Delta, if the teaching for King Merikare is historically correct.
I arose as lord of the city, whose heart was sad because of the Northland. From Hetshenu to Simbaka, and south to Two-Fish Channel, I pacified the entire west, as far as the coast of the sea. The land they had ravaged has been made into nomes. All kinds of large towns are in it. I made Lower Egypt attack them. I captured their inhabitants. I seized their cattle, until the Asiatics abhorred Egypt. Do not concern yourself with him. The Asiatic is a crocodile on its shore. It snatches from a lonely road. It cannot seize from a populous town.
Thus, when Mentuhotep II captured Heracleopolis, due to the previous unifying efforts of the 10th dynasty, his power would immediately extend to the Mediterranean. To the south, it's possible that the Theban dynasty had taken control over Lower Nubia, though hard evidence for this in Nubia itself is missing, and, even if the conquest took place, there's no doubt the Nubians would regain their independence prior to the fall of Heracleopolis. And so, when Mentuhotep II unifies Egypt, the kingdom once again extends from the First Cataract to the Mediterranean, and rises whole once again, after the long period of chaos it was plunged in. Egyptian civilization was still brilliant under the 6th dynasty. It conserved all the qualities that made the Old Kingdom great. However, the changes brought on by the First Intermediate Period will provoke an evolution. When the 6th dynasty emerged, Memphis was still the artistic capital of the country, but as Teti's reign continued, private monuments became just as important as royal. By the time of Merendre's reign, Memphis had lost its artistic primacy. The provincial cities, on the other hand, had profoundly decorated tombs. The style of these works does not match the quality of the 5th dynasty, but they are notable nonetheless. The provincialization of the arts becomes clearer with the arrival of the First Intermediate Period. Each nome had, for lack of a better term, its own distinct artistic style. These artistic works do not possess the virtuosity of the great Memphite artists, but their works, most notably mural paintings, possess a degree of spontaneity that is lacking in the great works of the Old Kingdom. The First Intermediate Period provided few royal monuments. Thanks to a new funerary custom, it provides many statuettes, both humans and animals. The scenes which were painted or carved on the tombs are substituted by a number of figurines. The custom appears at the end of the Old Kingdom and becomes common during the First Intermediate Period. Be it in stone, in alabaster or limestone, or, in most occasions, in painted wood, these figurines are destined to assure the possession of all necessary goods to life after death for the deceased. They include a great number of servants grinding the grain, making beer, or bringing offerings. But also include butchers putting down cattle, fishermen, weavers, and artisans, The political situation manifests itself with the presence of soldier models. Infantry soldiers armed in spear and shield, and archers carrying the bow. When the Egyptians could not assure the presence of these models in the tomb, the sarcophagus would be painted with them on the interior. Finally, coming from the south, a new category of objects multiply. The painted or recorded stelae, tasked with assuring that which is indispensable to the deceased, who is represented seated alone or accompanied with his wife, in front of a table full of varied offerings. The rare statues known from this period are made of wood. The artist puts all his efforts into the face, while the body remains rigid. The end of the Old Kingdom had a large degree of literary activity. Texts such as the Instruction of Hratch or the Maxims of Ptahhotep were written by the end of the Old Kingdom during the 5th dynasty. However, as the first intermediate period comes, literary activity largely dries up. Indeed, most texts not on tombs written about this period come from the Middle Kingdom, including the previously mentioned admonitions of Ipuwer and the teaching for King Merikare. Along with these, the Eloquent Peasant is another text written during the Middle Kingdom, which is set during the first intermediate period. Finally, the text called The Dispute Between a Man and His Ba, written during the 12th dynasty, may have been inspired by the political upheaval which took place during this time frame. The Eloquent Peasant is a story which takes place around Heracleopolis during either the 9th or 10th dynasty. It tells us a tale of a peasant from modern-day Wadi el-Natrum, then called the Salt Valley, from the Delta, who descends to Middle Egypt to sell his products. However, his caravan attracts a vassal of the High Steward who steals his goods. The outraged peasant first appeals to the man, before the case eventually reaches the Pharaoh of Egypt. The king's steward eventually ordered the goods stolen from the peasant to be returned to him, and compensated with all the property of the man who stole him. The story allows the author to focus on themes such as corruption and justice. The previously mentioned Teaching for King Merikare is a literary text which focuses more on rulership than historical events. While it does mention events of the first intermediate period, its main purpose is to serve as counsel for rulers. In fact, the text was presented as if it was the Pharaoh of Egypt, named Keti, leaving instructions on how to rule for his successor Merikare.
If you are skilled in speech, you will win. The tongue is a king's sword. Speaking is stronger than all fighting.
The dispute between a man and his Ba is different from the other texts. It is about a man wanting to put an end to his miserable life, and his Ba, meaning his soul, steps in, and the two argue back and forth. Eventually, they reach a compromise, that death should be accepted as the end of life, rather than an immediate solution to one's own problems, so that both man and soul may attain a proper afterlife together. It is speculative on my part, but this may be the oldest text discovered, which focuses on depression. The text perfectly encapsulates the melancholic feeling it's trying to portray.
Whom can I talk to today? Brothers are evil, and friends of today don't love each other. Whom can I talk to today? Hearts are greedy, and every man is stealing things from his fellow. Whom can I talk to today? None are righteous, and the land is left to evildoers. Whom can I talk to today? I am laden in misery for lack of an intimate friend. Death is in my sight today, a cure of a sick man. Like going outside after confinement, Death is in my sight, today like the smell of myrrh, like sitting under a sail on a windy day. Death is in my sight today, like the sky's clearing, like a man grasping thereby what he didn't know before. Death is in my sight today, like a man's longing to see home after he has spent years in captivity.
The chaos of the First Intermediate Period is a recurring trend for Egyptian texts written during the Middle Kingdom regarding this period. It is shown again and again, be it in the admonitions of Ipuwer, the eloquent peasant, and even the instruction to King Merikare, that the First Intermediate Period was an era of chaos, disorder, and corruption. While certainly not as prosperous of a period as the Old or Middle Kingdoms, the negative images painted by the later texts are certainly an exaggeration. It should always be kept in mind that the Middle Kingdom texts were literary works, not historical. Speaking of which, the contemporary tomb owners wanted to magnify their accomplishments by making the situation more dismal than it truly was, something which the later Egyptian kings would also do. But the Middle Kingdom texts are ultimately more of a reflection of the Middle Kingdom than of the First Intermediate Period. The Egyptian elite feared chaos and so made it the king's responsibility to avoid it. By exaggerating the dangers of instability, they championed a strong rule, something which would re-emerge in the Middle Kingdom. While Egypt fractured politically, it was nevertheless still in contact with the outside world. In fact, people still engaged in trade with neighboring regions, possibly independently from political powers. The country continued to import metals, semi-precious stones, and luxury items. The trading expeditions ranged from Punt at the southern tip of the Red Sea to Byblos in Lebanon. The fall of the Old Kingdom also had deep repercussions on religion. Under the First Intermediate Period, privates gradually appropriated the royal funerary prerogatives, as demonstrated in the appearance of the coffin texts, themselves partially derived from the pyramid texts. In the afterlife, the deceased would potentially become a king by writing these texts into the interior of his sarcophagus. Essentially, the right to the afterlife was no longer an exclusive right of the pharaoh. On the other hand, the disappearance of the Memphite kingdom led to the return of the provincial cults. Obscure and barely known gods of the Old Kingdom regain importance, such as Hepwawet of Asyut, Chnum of Elephantine, and above all, Montu of Thebes, the war god of the victorious 11th dynasty, who becomes one of the great Egyptian gods via assimilation with Ra after the unification of Egypt. Along with these changes, it's also worth noting the development of the cult of Osiris during the First Intermediate Period. The cult of Osiris had existed since the Archaic period and was already incorporated within the great theological systems. Osiris and his wife had originated from the Delta, and the couple is included among those divinely involved with the origin of the world. Divine hero, his tragic death and following resurrection made him the natural god of the dead. For this, he has an important role in the pyramid texts. However, in the eyes of the Memphite and Heliopolitan theologians, his importance could not be compared with that of the sun god Ra. As the First Intermediate Period is reaching its end, Osiris gradually becomes the great god, and so pilgrimages aren't so much reaching Heliopolis as they are in Abydos, where Osiris's main tomb is supposedly located. All of Egypt wished to be buried close to his temple, or at least leave a mark in their passage to the city. And so, Abydos becomes Egypt's great religious center, which may explain the obstinance of both Heracleopolis as well as Thebes in wanting to ensure its possession. The role assured by Osiris in religion starting from the beginning of the end of the Old Kingdom, is accompanied by an evolution in moral values. The ideas of justice and charity spread, and it becomes widely believed that one's own actions on earth will be judged in the afterlife. It is true that the judgment of the dead king already exists in the pyramid texts. In order for the king to be admitted within the circle of Ra, he must be pure, that is, undergone through the purification rituals. Must be, in the eyes of the god, just, more in a juridical sense than moral, and that he must be complete, in other words, his body intact. A figure would then ask questions to the deceased king, ensuring if all conditions were fulfilled. Only then would he be allowed to join his supposed place alongside Ra. The first intermediate period develops this judgment by extending it to all men. These beliefs will develop further as time passes into a true trial of the dead led by Osiris, assisted by the gods of all nomes. When the deceased arrives, his heart is placed on a scale against a feather, the symbol of the goddess Maat, goddess of justice and truth. Thoth, god of writing, Horus, and Anubis certify if the weight of the heart is right and that both plates are balanced. If they are, the dead's place is justified. If they are not, it is delivered to a great devourer, the goddess Amit, carrying the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, who would eat the deceased soul, destroying it forever and wiping it away from existence. This emphasis on justice is noted both through the works which were written during the Middle Kingdom, but speak of the first intermediate period, as well as the inscription of private tombs during the same period. The Autobiography of Anthology has already been mentioned, but other texts from the first intermediate period, including the Stela of Count Idi of Thys, the Stela of the butler Merer of Edfu, the Stela of the treasure Iti of Imiotro, and the Stela of the treasure Chechi, all emphasize that the deceased in question was a moral, upstanding man. As for texts written during the Middle Kingdom, the teaching for King Merikare is perhaps the most plainly obvious example.
Do not be evil. Kindness is good. Make your memorial last through love of you. Do justice, then you endure on earth. Calm the weeper. Don't oppress the widow. Don't expel a man from his father's property. Don't reduce the nobles and their possessions. Do not kill. It doesn't serve you.
Of course, in the same text, religion is emphasized.
Make your monuments worthy of the god. This keeps alive their maker's name. A man should do what profits his ba. Visit the temple, observe the mysteries, and to the shrine, eat bread in God's house. Make ample the daily offerings. It profits him who does it. God recognizes him who works for him.
If the Theban reunification of Egypt can be compared with that of the Thinite kings, there are, however, differences. The Old Kingdom left memories of a golden age which will be attempted to be replicated in future generations. In order to beat Heracleopolis, the Theban kings were forced to conciliate with the many other nomes. As such, in many cases, the nomarchs retained the authority they had acquired under the 6th dynasty. All the while, the victorious Theban pharaohs reign. Only during the 12th dynasty will royal power recuperate all its authority. Finally, the army, which up to that point had played a very limited role in Egyptian civilization, became very important. Each nome possessed their own army throughout the first intermediate period. Combined with Nubian and Libyan mercenaries, one can see what sort of threatening power a nomarch could possess in front of this reunified Egypt. Their importance is highlighted in the teaching for King Merikare.
Advance your officials, promote your soldiers, enrich the young men who follow you, provide with goods, endow the fields, reward them with herds.
And so, with the ascension of Mentuhotep II, Egypt comes out of the first intermediate period transformed. The Theban pharaohs have in their hands the political and military power which will allow them to control Egypt and eventually establish Egyptian hegemony over its neighbors. Before the unification of Egypt, there were 3 pharaohs of the 11th dynasty, Intef I, II, and III. The origin for the 11th dynasty lies in a man bearing no royal titles, called Intef, of the same name as his eventual royal successors. He was the nomarch of Thebes during the first intermediate period. A stela in Cairo found at Thebes likely belonged to him, naming the person in question as a member of the elite, foremost of action, great overlord of the Theban province, and great pillar, who keeps alive the 2 lands. The boastful claim aside, Intef was initially a governor, not unlike any other, during this period. Inscriptions found at Tendera also mention an Intef, this one bearing the title of Great Overlord of Upper Egypt. This could mean that Intef had managed to extend his rule to Tendera. However, the name of Intef was simply too common for us to draw a definitive conclusion that the 2 inscriptions were of the same man. Another Theban governor who belonged to the 11th dynasty was Mentuhotep. Later generations of the 11th dynasty would consider him a pharaoh. However, it's very likely he was never a king. Regardless, he is typically listed as Mentuhotep I. The first man of the 11th dynasty likely to have claimed a royal titulary was Intef I. His Horus name was Seherutawi, meaning he who contends the 2 countries. He is only known from later sources, as no contemporary inscription can be attributed to him with certainty. A relief discovered at Todd, belonging to a temple building of Mentuhotep II, provides vital evidence for the position of Intef I. The relief shows 3 kings bearing all the same name of Intef, as well as their Horus names, being Seherutawi for Intef I, Wahankh, meaning enduring of life, for Intef II, and likely Nachneb Tep Nefer, meaning Horus, the victorious one, Lord of the good beginning, for Intef III. It would seem that Intef I did not appear as full king or was hesitant to take over the full range of the royal attributes, as his royal titulary remains incomplete. It would be under Intef II that Theban control would extend to large parts of Upper Egypt. Thanks to several preserved inscriptions of private individuals from his rather long reign, it's possible to provide a rough outline of the events and step-by-step growth of his kingdom. It was him who conquered Abydos and Thinis. As for the last of the pre-unified Theban kings, there aren't many concrete events recorded for the reign of Intef III. The 4th ruler, the already mentioned Mentuhotep II, would unify the country. Throughout his reign, Mentuhotep changed his Horus titulary 2 times. Through the death of his predecessor, he adopts the Horus name of Senchiptawi, meaning he who invigorates the heart of the 2 lands. After a successful campaign against the rulers of Heracleopolis, he adopts his 2nd titulary of Netcheri Hedjet, meaning the Divine One of the White Crown. The White Crown in question was that of Upper Egypt. When unification is finalized, he adopts the Horus titulary of Sematawi, meaning he who unifies the two lands. On his way to pacify the country, Mentuhotep seems to have used both force as well as diplomacy. It is in this way that, though defeated, the nomarchs of Hermopolis and Beni Hassan, the latter of which control the Oryx nome, keep their titles, while the nomarch of Asyut was simply deposed. In order to ensure his authority of the country, Mentuhotep employed an exclusive of Theban officials for the most important roles, such as that of the vizier or the chancellor. A massive centralization effort took place throughout the country. The posts of governor of Lower Egypt as well as governor of Upper Egypt were created, both of whom had power over their respective nomarchs. Finally, Mentuhotep also turned to religion. With the collapse of the Old Kingdom, the divine legitimacy of the pharaoh had lost much of its gravitas. The afterlife was no longer the king's exclusive right. But at the very least, he was still supposed to be God on earth. In order to strengthen his divine right to rule, Mentuhotep conducted a massive program of self-deification, emphasizing the divinity of his nature. The benefits resulting from this new administration were quickly visible, both inside and outside Egypt. As peace throughout the country is re-established, Mentuhotep begins once again relations with his neighboring countries. Starting in the south, an expedition penetrates into Nubia. It will be followed by many others, as these incursions begin an expansionist policy towards the south that will continue in the following dynasty. Sometime during the First Intermediate Period, Lower Nubia, taking advantage of the chaos, may have regained its independence. This was the first attested appearance of the term Kush for Nubia in Egyptian records. This new kingdom of Kush became a thorn in Egyptian trade, hence the effort of the Theban king to conquer it. What followed from this campaign was perhaps not quite what Mentuhotep wanted, but was satisfactory enough. Nubia pays a tribute to Egypt and no longer opposes the passage of Egyptian traders. Finally, Kush provides mercenaries to the Egyptian army. Perhaps in order to ensure the tributary state of Kush, Mentuhotep posted a garrison on the island fortress of Elephantine, so troops could be rapidly deployed southwards. Towards the east, there's evidence Mentuhotep launched campaigns against Canaan. Over in the Sinai Peninsula, the fact that a future pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, Senusret I, dedicates a statue to Mentuhotep implies it was this ruler who reopened the trade of turquoise and copper in this area. Thus, it implies control over the nomadic tribes of the peninsula. Mentuhotep also sent expeditions into Libya. Remarkably, an inscription was found at Gebal el-Uwaynat, deep into the Sahara Desert, close to the modern-day border between Libya and Sudan, which names the king and attests trade contacts with this region. In one of these campaigns, a Libyan chief was killed. The western oases are visited by armed forces, in the same way as the desert, both east and west, as well as in Lower Nubia, where a group which the Egyptians refer to as the Magi roamed, nomadic warriors which Mentuhotep claims to have defeated. Under Mentuhotep, Egypt becomes once again an active artistic center. The king erected numerous monuments from Upper Egypt up to Abydos. Even in Thebes, he creates a notable monument, the first truly important royal tomb since the reign of Pepi II. Built in Deir el-Bahari, it is both his most ambitious as well as innovative building project. While the building may have originally contained the pyramid, it is no more. In truth, it is a wide mortuary temple, in which the pyramid, if it did exist, was merely a part of the building, and not merely its most notable feature. In many ways, it is a break from the Old Kingdom tradition, and would be a source of inspiration for future temples. The most profound innovation, however, is not architectural, but religious. It is the first mortuary temple where the king is not just a recipient of offerings, but also reenacts ceremonies for the gods, in this particular case, Amun-Ra. Furthermore, it identifies the king with Osiris, the god of the dead, which would be repeated in the funerary temples of many future pharaohs. Finally, it is notable that this specific location was likely extremely well thought out. From a mere aesthetic point, the site of the temple, located against the cliffs, is remarkable. But the temple's location is also aligned with the Temple of Karnak, on the other side of the Nile. During the beautiful festival of the valley, the statue of Amun was brought annually to Deir el-Bahari, and so, upon the construction of this temple, the procession of this festival, that of the bark led by Amun, would end in Mentuhotep's temple. As the year 2000 BCE approaches, Mentuhotep II passes away. When he unified Egypt, he had ruled as an independent monarch for 39 years, meaning that, according to the Turin King List, he ruled the unified Egypt for 12. His total reign is 51 years. By the time Mentuhotep II died, he was already quite old, and so, at the time of his death, his eldest son had already passed away. Therefore, it would be a different son of his, one too well past the age of manhood, who would assume the title of pharaoh. That would be Mentuhotep III, who also carried the titulary of Sankare, meaning giving life to the soul of Re, which emphasizes the continuity and intent to sustain the prestige acquired by his father. His much shorter reign of 12 years, according to the Turin King List, is most notable for the numerous building projects, particularly temples, most notably in Upper Egypt. Throughout his reign, another figure is noteworthy, a steward named Henenu, who had already served Mentuhotep II. Leading 3,000 men on an expedition, he traveled from Coptos through the eastern desert, until he arrived at the Red Sea, where then he and his men would set sail to Punt, looking for incense. A large rock inscription in Wadi Hammamat has preserved the memory of this expedition. Life conditions in early Middle Kingdom history were known through the correspondence of a priest named Hekanacht, preserved in the homonymous papyrus, written for his eldest son. Hekanacht possessed a farm, which, in his absence, was managed by his offspring. Before leaving, Hekanacht had left an inventory of farm products needed for the year, and then wrote 2 long letters giving directives towards what was necessary to give to the various members of the family. The property includes those which belong to him, as well as others he is renting. The rents of the latter were paid in fabrics and cereal. The letters also contain numerous commentaries on how one must conduct himself towards family and servants. Finally, in these letters, there is an allusion to a serious drought occurring south from Thebes, where, according to him, the population had already started eating men. The last king of the 11th dynasty was Mentuhotep IV. He does not appear in the Turin King List, nor in the Abydos King List. But through other sources, we know that there was a 7-year period between Mentuhotep III and Amenemhat I, the first king of the 12th dynasty. It was during this period which Mentuhotep IV reigned. It has been argued that, because of his absence from the king list, that he was a usurper, but there are no further signs of such. it was above all else the inscriptions found in Wadi Hammamat, which allow us to know his reign. There, in the second year of his reign, he sent an expedition of 10,000 men led by a vizier named Amenemhat, in order to bring the stone necessary for the construction of his royal sarcophagus. The main interest of this expedition resides in the personality of the vizier himself, who dedicated 4 different inscriptions to the several miracles which occurred during the expedition, including animals who indicate by their own behavior where to explore the necessary stone, as well as a sudden rainstorm that revealed a well full of water. It's possible that, where we wouldn't see anything more than a happy set of circumstances, the Egyptians would have seen the manifestation of divine will. It may have explained why Amenemhat was so interested in conserving the memory of these miracles. Indeed, it would seem the leader of the expedition was able to take advantage of the favor he received from the gods, as 5 years after these events, the vizier would become the pharaoh. How Amenemhat became the pharaoh is the source for much discussion among Egyptologists. Perhaps he was chosen by the potentially childless king to be his successor, or perhaps he usurped power. Perhaps it was a different Amenemhat who became the pharaoh, though it is generally assumed that the vizier and the pharaoh are one and the same. In any case, it would seem that his ascension was not violent, though there is no doubt Amenemhat becoming the new pharaoh was not exactly approved by every single Egyptian. When Amenemhat rises to the throne, he assumes the throne name of Sehetepibri, meaning he who satisfies the heart of Ra. Not being of royal blood, an opposition to his power manifested. His birth status is evidently shown in a text known as the Prophecy of Neferti. It describes, at first, a period of turbulence throughout Egypt, and then the coming of a southern king who will bring order and prosperity back to the country, revealing the pharaoh's name as Ameni. The text does not hide that this Ameni is the son of a woman from Taseti, the last nome before Nubia. The non-royal origins of the hero king are in fact insisted upon. He is the savior king from humble origins that will save Egypt from his time of troubles. The text thus hints at turbulence in the final stages of Mentuhotep IV's reign, though inscriptions of a governor also speak of turbulence at the very beginning of the new pharaoh's reign. Said Prophecy of Neferti was in fact written after Amenemhat had ascended to the throne, making it in reality not much of a prophecy. The father of Amenemhat, a certain Senusret, will later be regarded by New Kingdom Egyptians as the forefather of the 12th dynasty. Amenemhat reorganized Egypt by re-establishing the traditional limits of the nomes. He also changed the capital from Thebes to a different city, Ichawi, or by its full name, Amenemhat Ichawi, meaning Amenemhat seizes the two lands, located nearby both modern-day Cairo and the previous Egyptian capital of Memphis. The reasons for changing the capital seem to be complex. On one hand, the family of the previous pharaoh, Mentuhotep IV, despite being removed from power, were still very powerful within Thebes, and so the city may not have been safe for the new sovereign ruler, though this is contradicted by available evidence which indicates this change happened late in his reign. Furthermore, Thebes was poorly located to be the capital of Egypt. Located nearby the delta, the new capital is in a much more central position, and indeed, it could have been a symbolic act. As the name of the city implies, it was exactly at the place where the Egyptians themselves see as the middle of the country. It has also been speculated that this choice for the new capital may have been a defensive-minded policy in order to keep watch over potential Asiatic incursions into the delta. The new capital was rather small. It wasn't a major commercial or cultural center of Egypt, containing only for the most part administrative buildings as well as a royal residence, being populated by the administrative staff who ran those buildings. It would seem, however, that there weren't enough public workers to fulfill the needs of his new centralized administration. The first intermediate period had led to a lot of chaos, and the centralized administrative culture of Memphis had effectively vanished at this point. And so, in order to entice more workers, Amenemhat initiates a campaign of propaganda. Throughout his reign, 2 different works were written to encourage Egyptians into a royal administrative career. The first of these, known as XVIth, was written by the same author of the Prophecy of Neferti. It appeals to the Egyptian population by pointing out that a royal scribe cannot be poor. Another work may have been written during his reign, that being the Satire of the Trades, with the same goal as XVIth. This particular work plainly states that the office of the scribe is far superior to any other trade in the kingdom. Amenemhat didn't simply have to reorganize the kingdom that had recently abandoned anarchy. He still needed to elevate the monarchical prestige that had been obliterated by the first intermediate period, in which inscriptions and tales did not hesitate in presenting the pharaoh in undesirable, if not outright humiliating positions, an attitude which did not exist during the Old Kingdom, where the divine nature of the pharaoh was unquestionable. In order to fight this behavior, Amenemhat seeks to associate himself with the Old Kingdom, as demonstrated by his Horus name of Wehemesu, meaning rebirth. In particular, he associates himself with the pharaoh Sneferu, who seems to have maintained a degree of prestige greater than his contemporary Old Kingdom monarchs. However, the political situation was still too unstable, and the provincial nobles were still too powerful to allow the pharaoh to re-establish the centralized absolute monarchy of the Old Kingdom. Consequently, Amenemhat has to be satisfied with merely putting a tighter leash on the nobility, via the delegation of public workers directly loyal to him, controlling the nomarchs. At the same time, he ensures his succession by naming his eldest son, Senusret, as co-regent. In effect, there were now 2 kings of Egypt, Amenemhat, the senior ruler, and Senusret, the junior ruler. This would discourage a potential succession crisis. It would avoid the nomarchs from allying together against a new ruler, for he wouldn't need to ascend to the throne after his father's death. He had already ascended, along with the entire support base he had constructed for himself prior to his sole rule. This use of co-regency will be practiced by other pharaohs of the 12th dynasty. While Amenemhat cannot completely recreate the Old Kingdom, his control over Egypt is notable. He is free to tax the nomes, he had delineated their borders, and he had even re-established the census. Through vigilance of the nobility, royal power is stronger than it had ever been since the death of Pepi II. And so, the royal treasury became one of the most essential organisms of the 12th dynasty. The king possesses its own fleet, and it is entirely in the hands of public workers who live in his court and answer only to him, completely independent from the nomarchs. The co-regency coincides with an increased activity towards the exterior of Egypt, as Amenemhat gives his son authority over the army. In the beginning of his reign, any military activities were conducted inside his domain, such as a foreign intrusion over the delta, and certainly in the defeat of his internal enemies. Then, in order to avoid it from occurring again, he built fortifications throughout his borders, one series of forts lying east to defend the country from Asia, and another in the west to defend it against the Libyans. Despite being denominated as the so-called Walls of the Prince, they were not continuous, and merely a series of fortifications which controlled the obligatory passages. But as Senusret becomes co-regent, the Egyptian army begins conducting campaigns outside their lands, led by the co-regent himself. It is in one of these campaigns, in Libya, that Senusret discovers his father Amenemhat was assassinated. It would seem that, even after changing the capital and enforcing a greater degree of control over the country, the former vizier had not been fully safe from his internal enemies. He had been pharaoh of Egypt for 30 years. The first king of the 12th dynasty had largely modeled his rule after those of the Old Kingdom, and his royal tomb was no exception. At modern-day El-Lisht, nearby Cairo, he had ordered the construction of his tomb, which, like the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, was a pyramid. It was, both in height and base, around 3 times smaller than the Pyramid of Giza, which may be one of the reasons why it didn't last. Its construction was also only achieved through previous works, as blocks from other pyramids, including those of Khufu, Khafra, Hunas, and Pepi II, were found within the pyramid. The work done on the pyramid was rather poor, and very little of it remains today. The construction of this pyramid, however, would be significant, as it would mark the definitive return of their construction. Indeed, most, if not all, pharaohs of the 12th dynasty would build their own pyramids. The events regarding the end of Amenemhat's reign are known through a text called the Instructions of Amenemhat. The text itself is not quite historically accurate, as it is, after all, a piece of literature. In it, it is the deceased king who informs, communicating from the other world, of his assassination to his son. Realizing that he needed to enforce his claim, Senusret rushed back to the capital. Back in Egypt, he put down the rebellious forces which had aligned against him, becoming the undisputed sole ruler of Egypt. By his 8th year, Senusret had re-established firm control over Egypt and was ready to expand his kingdom. He had begun a military campaign against Nubia and expanded Egypt to the Second Cataract of the Nile. Several officials participated in this campaign. Among them was the nomarch of Oryx, who carried the same name as his king's father. With the Middle Kingdom, the search for gold is among the motives for the Egyptian penetration into Upper Nubia. It's around this time that the gold mines of modern-day Sudan begin to be fully exploited by Egypt. In relation to Asia, it would seem Senusret had a peaceful attitude towards them. The need for turquoise and copper, which was left interrupted after the reign of Pepi II, returns in full swing. During the Old Kingdom, the relations between Egyptians and the nomads of the Sinai were tense, as demonstrated in the war scenes carved onto the rocks. With the 12th dynasty, the relationship changes. Egyptians and Asiatics record their inscriptions side by side, as if they were working together for the exploration of the mines. The story of Senusret, likely written during his reign, points to this. The titular character of this tale, Senusret, runs off to Asia in the beginning of Senusret's reign and stays there for over 20 years. The tale does not mention, during this time period, a single war between Egypt and any Asiatic kingdom. The Syro-Palestinian principates, independent from Egypt, maintain excellent relations with the pharaohs. His messengers are free to travel through them unbothered. The excavations from the Syro-Palestinian corridor provided many Egyptian objects from the Middle Kingdom. These objects are evidence of a considerably strong commerce between Egypt and Asia during this period. The re-establishment of Egyptian power isn't limited to Nubia and Asia. Starting from the co-regency, the desert was once again controlled, and, under his sole reign, Senusret maintained these efforts. Starting from Thebes, the Egyptians went deep into the western oasis. In Libya proper, the campaigns which preceded the assassination of Amenemhat seems to have assured tranquility, and for the rest of his reign, there are no more issues with the Libyans. When his reign ends, Egypt controls Lower Nubia from Aswan to the Second Cataract. It has kept good relations with Asia and has subjugated the Libyans. Its expeditions for minerals go without issues both in the eastern and western deserts. This exterior spread is the result of the internal prosperity of the country, re-established by Senusret, though he has changed very little in his state diplomacy compared to his father. The prestige of the monarchy is re-established. If it's true that the king still uses the epitaph of Neter Nefer, meaning the good god, he is apparently presented more like a supernatural human than a god, though modern scholarship questions this portrayal. But his authority is nevertheless uncontested. The human character of this power, perhaps under the influence of the Osirian cult, contrasts with the inhuman authority of the monarch of the Old Kingdom. In order to ensure the continuity of the dynasty, Senusret named his son Amenemhat co-regent. The role of the vizier still exists, but his authority begins to fragment, as the vizier begins being consistently replaced, perhaps to ensure the conditions which led to his father's ascension wouldn't repeat. That being said, the vizier is still very powerful. He is still the chief of justice and administration over whatever territory is handed to him. It is him who drafts the law and maintains the archives. Furthermore, he is also responsible for the economy. Thus, he possesses all power except that of the army. Only the geographic extension of his authority is limited. Senusret continued with the reorganization of Egypt's administration, and his reign is one of economic prosperity for the country. The provincial necropolis demonstrate the wealth of the nomes during this period, most notable of which is that of Beni Hassan of the Oryx nome. The first pharaohs of the 12th dynasty also looked for new resources, particularly in the region of Fayum, near the new capital, for agricultural purposes. This policy would be continued by Senusret's successors, most notably Amenemhat III. The numerous monuments that were either built or restored under his reign demonstrate the economic recovery of Egypt during his period. From the delta to Aswan, there is no important place that does not have vestiges of activity. The most important of Senusret's work was the restoration of the Temple of Heliopolis, which was done for both political and religious reasons. Heliopolis is the residence of the sun god Ra, and the dynasty has an interest in re-establishing the influence of a cult and priesthood, recognized by the entire country At the same time, the god of Heliopolis is, in effect, ever since the Old Kingdom, the protector god of the monarchy. The pharaoh uses the title Son of Ra. Senusret decided then to affirm himself as the legitimate descendant of all the pharaohs that have ruled over Egypt. Finally, the temple is a great center of pilgrimages. By embellishing it, Senusret will attract more pilgrims. Senusret presumably died after 45 years in power, as that is what's inscribed in the Turin king list. He had continued his father's project in re-establishing a powerful and organized monarchy. His successors only had to maintain what he had accomplished. His immediate successor was Amenemhat II, who had already been co-regent. Compared to his predecessors, his reign isn't quite as well documented. His ascension to power was apparently peaceful. He did not come to the throne under dubious circumstances as his grandfather, nor did he have to deal with a rebellion as his father. During his reign, the mining expeditions to the Sinai Peninsula continued. The outside maintained straining relations with Egypt, most notably a series of boxes carrying his name of treasure containing silver objects found under the temple of Montu at Thoth. These objects were not from Asia, but from the Aegean, heavily suggesting that trading relations went much further away than just Palestine or Nubia. The commercial relations also extend to the south, as under Amenemhat II, Egypt made an expedition to the region of Punt. These expeditions indicate that, despite his reign being rather obscure, Egypt was prosperous, further confirmed by the wealth of the provincial tombs as well as his royal pyramid, which was built in Dashur, named the White Pyramid. Unfortunately, it is nothing more than a pile of rubble today. Amenemhat II ruled Egypt for at least 35 years. Succeeding Amenemhat II was his son Senusret II. He too was named co-regent and reigned for 3 years with his father. The total length of his reign has been a debated subject among Egyptologists. Throughout his reign, he is content with the inspection of the Nubian fortresses, the exploration of mines in the Sinai as well as Wadi Hammamat, which testifies the economic prosperity of Egypt, further confirmed by the development of the Fayum Oasis. It is during his reign in which the Asiatic foreigners visiting the pharaoh with gifts is recorded. These foreigners were led by a man named Abisha the Hyksos. This would be the first instance in which the word Hyksos was used, one which will become far more important for the history of Egypt. The first 4 rulers of the 12th dynasty had managed to bring economic prosperity into the country after its reunification and subsequent pacification, reorganizing its administrative makeup and restoring royal authority. Internally, the pharaoh of Egypt and his gravitas were respected, without harming the privileges which the local nobility enjoyed. The internal policy of the second half of the dynasty will reveal itself to be vastly different. The 5th pharaoh of the 12th dynasty is Senusret III. It is under his reign that the Middle Kingdom reaches the height of its power and prestige. The first pharaohs of this dynasty had reached and stayed in power, working in tandem with the kingdom's local lords, and so had avoided removing their privileges. Senusret III was the exact opposite. At a certain point during his reign, the texts stop mentioning nomarchs. From that point onwards, the provinces are administered from the royal residency. The kingdom would be divided into 3 separate administrative regions called Waret, the north containing the delta, the south containing most of Upper Egypt, and the head of south containing the original Theban kingdom. This reorganization seemed to have destroyed the influence of the nomarchs for good, as the nomarchs would never recover the power and influence they had throughout the first intermediate period and the previous stages of the Middle Kingdom. There's also no record that Senusret III ever took direct military action against the local nobility. It is true the power of the nomarchs had been declining, but this administrative reform was apparently the coup de grace. Outside Egypt, Senusret III also breaks the previously established policy of the 12th dynasty, as he will carry out military campaigns in both Africa and Asia. While it is true we don't know with great amount of detail what happened in the 2nd millennium BCE, it doesn't seem as if Nubia had become particularly threatening during his predecessor's reign. It would seem, however, that thanks to the influence from Egypt, Upper Nubia had greatly developed. Thus, a new power had constituted around Kerma between the 2nd and 3rd cataracts. The relations between both were not always hostile. Egypt, entrenched behind its forts, initially sticks to its borders. However, Senusret III may have deemed this new Nubian state too much of a threat, and so he acts with the intent of further taming Kush. He embarks on 4 different expeditions down south, passing beyond the 2nd cataract. To reinforce and protect the southern territories controlled by Egypt, he installs a series of fortifications, from Semna to Buhan. He also directs strict orders to contain any possible infiltration of Nubian troops towards Egypt. These instructions would be followed by his successors. Northeast of Egypt, the peaceful coexistence with the Asiatics seems to have come to an end, and the mineral expeditions have to be militarily supported. Senusret III commanded an army into Asia where he would conquer the city of Sekmen, likely Shashem, a bit further north from Jerusalem. The Egyptian execration texts, written on pottery with the purpose of cursing Egypt's enemies, list a series of rulers and Asiatic peoples, which testifies a good amount of knowledge of the political situation in the Syro-Palestinian corridor and the threat that these people represented for Egypt during the later stages of the 12th dynasty. His successive military campaigns, along with the administrative reorganization, led Egypt to an era of peace and economic prosperity, along with a revival in craftwork, trade, and economic development. So great was Senusret III's reign and legacy that he was one of the very few pharaohs who were deified and honored with a cult within their own lifetime. At the time he died, royal power was at its height. Egypt is safely protected from both incursions from the south as well as the east. The elimination of the role of the nomarch as a vital function of the kingdom has led to the centralization of power. Economically, Egypt is prosperous. Senusret III ruled Egypt for about half a century. He was buried in the pyramid complex he had built in Dashur, somewhat close to the still-standing Red Pyramid of Sneferu. Unfortunately, Senusret III's pyramid is little more than a pile of rubble today. Senusret III was succeeded by his son and co-regent Amenemhat III, who seems to have had a peaceful reign. He remained as Egypt's ruler for at least 45 years, though his sole rule was far shorter, which was dedicated towards the country's economic development. The explanation of the Sinai's economic resources was intensified. Nearly 60 inscriptions from Amenemhat III's reign were discovered there. Other mining regions, such as Wadi Hammamat and the south, seem to have had a similar degree of activity. But the main symbol of this reign's economic prosperity were the massive building programs which were taken. including the construction and enlargement of many different temples, as well as fortresses throughout Egypt. The most notable work, however, is the construction of the Great Canal, which links the Fayum Oasis with the Nile River, which allows agricultural works throughout a large portion of the land throughout the region. Such was the prosperity of Amenemhat's reign that he would be the first pharaoh since Neferu of the 4th dynasty to build more than one pyramid for himself. Unfortunately, neither of the two pyramids stand today. The first of these, the Black Pyramid, was built in Dashur, though the king himself would not be buried there. The second was built in Hawara, in the Fayum Oasis. The mortuary temple beside it was called the Labyrinth by classical writers such as Herodotus and Strabo. Today, the Labyrinth stands no more, but according to Herodotus, its greatness surpassed that of even the pyramids. The Middle Kingdom was one of Egypt's golden ages. After managing to stumble out of the first intermediate period, the restored power of the country spread its culture beyond its borders. Both the Syro-Palestinian corridor as well as Upper Nubia, without being under the direct authority of the pharaoh, were influenced by Egyptian literature and art. This cultural spread surpasses even the border states and into pre-Hellenic Europe, particularly the island of Crete, likely via Syria and Cyprus, as Egyptian objects find themselves far outside the country. Though its imperial gains were limited, as in the east, its direct control couldn't have gone beyond Palestine, and in the south couldn't go much beyond the Second Cataract, its culture spread far beyond it. The official rhetoric towards non-Egyptians became far more hostile during the Middle Kingdom, and the need to subdue them was far more loudly proclaimed than before. However, the reality was the Egyptians had to interact with foreign people. As mentioned before, Egypt had trading relations with the surrounding regions, most notably Palestine and Nubia, and they maintained diplomatic relations with their inhabitants. Mentuhotep II, for an example, married several Nubian women, likely after concluding treaties with the various leaders of the region. Foreigners were allowed to migrate into Egypt, and perhaps were even invited into the country to provide labor. Nubians were present from the Old Kingdom onward, and people from Syria and Palestine became numerous during the Middle Kingdom. People explicitly identified as Asiatic were common. They were often servants, mostly women, who appear in the accounts of various households. Some of these seem to have had more foreigners than Egyptians in their staff. However, it should be noted the influx of Asiatics seems to have increased, in particular, in the 13th dynasty, most of them settling in the eastern delta. The lower Nubians may have been a source of fear for the Egyptians, but they simply weren't well organized enough to pose a real threat. Such an enemy was encountered further south in Kerma, formed during the late Old Kingdom, which, while seen negatively by the Egyptians, was ultimately an intermediary between the Middle Kingdom and sub-Saharan Africa. The Egyptians did try to obtain sub-Saharan goods without Nubian intermediaries, and accordingly launched expeditions on the Red Sea for that purpose, but nevertheless, trade with Nubia continued. The Egyptians may have seen them as enemies, but if they wanted access to African goods, they could not ignore them. The relationship with the East was very different. First was the Sinai, home to stones and minerals. Beyond lay the regions of Syria and Palestine, home to urban cultures under the leadership of local kings. And finally, the Eastern Desert. Its inhabitants had a lifestyle that was vastly different from the Egyptians. They were nomads rather than town or village people. the lack of water made agriculture essentially impossible, so people raised sheep and goats and guided them to pasture, following the seasons. The relationship with the nomads of the desert went back and forth between peaceful and hostile. The Egyptians referred to the inhabitants of this region as the Magi and would build forts in Lower Nubia in order to control them. At the same time, however, they were also recruited into the Egyptian army to monitor the region. Starting from the Middle Kingdom onward, the Magi would act as a police force, first in the desert and later in the Nile Valley as well. In the Sinai, people too lived as nomads. As for Palestine, the author of the story of Senusret also acts under the assumption that the same is applicable. However, archaeology tells us Palestine and Syria were made up of city-states with fortified urban centers. The rulers of these states were in contact with one another, as well as kingdoms in Mesopotamia and western Iran. But in their correspondence, they do not refer to Egypt. However, Egypt was in contact with the region. The Egyptians would obtain cedar from Lebanon, crucial for building projects and coffins, as well as the resin that came from such trees for mummification. From the Levant, Egypt also imported olive oil and wine. Most temples of the Middle Kingdom have unfortunately disappeared, but from what we gather that has survived the sands of time, the reliefs on their walls match those of the Old Kingdom in perfection. The objects and artifacts that survived demonstrate that the Middle Kingdom artisans were just as skilled as those of the Old. It's particularly during the 12th dynasty that this perfection was reached. Its artists substitute the serene and unmoving image of the Old Kingdom pharaoh for that of a man in which the tribulations of a life in power mold the face, sometimes tragic and tormented. The realistic figure on the portraits of Senusret III and Amenemhat III demonstrate the perfection of Egyptian art. The Middle Kingdom is also a golden age of Egyptian literature. Its texts will serve as models for the upcoming generations. Indeed, for the rest of Egyptian history, the Egyptians themselves would regard the Middle Kingdom as the classical age of their literature. Many of these works were largely inspired by the sovereign rulers themselves with a political intent. Indeed, many Middle Kingdom texts were largely works of propaganda. This includes the previously mentioned Admonitions of Ipuwer, the Satire of the Trades, the Prophecy of Neferti, and Kemet. However, Egyptian literature loses nothing from it. Some of the works, most notably the previously mentioned story of Senusret, as well as the tale of the shipwrecked sailor, were literary masterpieces of this age. And, on a personal level, I was impressed how the dispute between a man and his ba portrayed so effectively the feeling of melancholia, despite only reading a translation. Later Egyptians would use Middle Kingdom works to educate scribes. For some compositions, we have dozens of copies students made in the New Kingdom, and it seems that there was a curriculum they had to learn. Since for so long the literary dialect of the Middle Kingdom was the only proper language for certain official and religious texts, it is hardly surprising. The works written during the Middle Kingdom don't merely apply to just literary fiction. It is also during this period where scientific works, most notably mathematical and medical papyri, are composed. Finally, religious literature is equally further advanced with the coffin texts, of which several of them were eventually compiled into the Book of Two Ways. This work would be a precursor to the New Kingdom books of the Underworld, as well as the Book of the Dead, greatly influencing the evolution and transformation of Egyptian religion. During the Middle Kingdom, the god host Cyrus became so popular that people, both king and elite, established monuments resembling funerary constructions at Abydos, while their tombs were elsewhere. people from a surprising social range built chapels in order to receive funerary offerings, in which they set up steles, engraved with representations of themselves and sometimes accounts of their lives. As the Middle Kingdom progressed, these inscriptions became hymns to Osiris, with a mention of the deceased person's name. Though the sizes of the chapels varied in size depending on the social class of the deceased, this practice of setting up cenotaphs became so widespread it got out of hand, and the pharaoh Wegaf of the 13th dynasty tried to regulate it, unsuccessfully. The aim of this was to have a close association with the cult of Osiris, which would continue in later times. Other gods received greater recognition in the Middle Kingdom than they had before. The Theban origin of the 11th dynasty had created a rival of the sun god Ra of the north, the city's own major deity Amun. The two gods merged together as Amun-Ra, the supreme divinity of Egypt, and Thebes became the city of the sun in the south. The prominence of the Theban pantheon is also clear in the following dynasty, as the name Amenemhat invokes Amun, while Senusret means men of Wazret, perhaps the name of a goddess who was Amun's original companion. And so, after the end of the First Intermediate Period, the pharaohs of the 11th and 12th dynasty brought back into Egypt an age of prosperity, which would translate into a civilizational development in all its aspects. The reigns of Senusret III and Amenemhat III were the height of the Middle Kingdom. But the door of history begins closing on it upon their deaths. Amenemhat IV would be the next pharaoh, but his reign was short-lived, and without a possible successor to his throne, the next ruler would be a woman, daughter of Amenemhat III, Sobekneferu. It's unclear what her relationship with the previous pharaoh was, though Manetho asserts they were brother and sister. However, Amenemhat IV's mother was not given the title of king's wife. Very little is known of Sobekneferu's reign, but upon her death, the 12th dynasty comes to an end. It is replaced by the much weaker 13th dynasty. The Middle Kingdom is no more, and the Second Intermediate Period has begun. Or at least, it could be so. Scholars debate over the exact end of the Middle Kingdom. Commonly, the Second Intermediate Period begins with the 13th dynasty. Alternatively, it begins with the 15th. The 12th dynasty was a period of great political stability. For around 200 years, a single family had ruled the whole country. The following dynasty marks a complete contrast, with many kings ruling for only a short period. Very few of them seem to have been connected by family ties. Why this dynasty had so many rulers, we don't know. A convincing explanation for it simply does not exist. It has been assumed many of them were usurpers, but there is little evidence for this. There are almost no signs that the kings of the 13th dynasty were foreigners, as only one king has a name which sounds foreign, but he is particularly well attested in the sources, and there he appears as fully Egyptian. In the entire history of Egypt, there is no period as obscure as the one that begins with the 13th dynasty and ends with the rise of the 18th. Though the 13th dynasty has been often associated with a period of chaos and disorder, it may have been in fact more peaceful than once originally thought, since the central government in each Tawi was sustained during most of the dynasty, and the country remained relatively stable. Contemporary documentation on court officials shows us the government practices of the 12th dynasty continued a long time after them. At the very least, the administrative bureaucracy remained just as strong and well organized during the 13th dynasty. The names of the rulers of the early 13th dynasty remained preserved in the Turin king list. There are many issues with details, but there is a general agreement on the correctness of the broad outline of the sequence. All in all, in around 150 years, about 50 to 60 pharaohs ruled Egypt, meaning the average pharaoh of the 13th dynasty ruled for about 3 years. However, some rulers seem to have had quite a long reign of 10 and perhaps even 20 years, making it likely there were quite a number of pharaohs who ruled for a minuscule amount of time. Unfortunately, the part of the Turin king list where the second half of the 13th dynasty rulers are named is badly damaged. At that point, it is quite clear they no longer rule over a unified country. Either as the 13th dynasty began or a few decades into it, the delta at large would fragment away from Egypt, giving rise to the newly formed 14th dynasty. Egypt, reunified by the 11th, would be divided again. It would remain that way for about 2 centuries, during which it would be invaded by Asiatic foreigners they called the Hyksos. But Egypt would be liberated and come together under a single ruler once again, which would start the third and final golden age of Egypt, called the New Kingdom. But that is for another time. Thank you for watching. I'd like to thank the people who provided their voices for the Teaching to King Merikare, A Dispute Between a Man and His Ba, and the Autobiography of Ankhtifi. Each of them is a YouTuber in their own right. Namely, the voice for Teaching to King Merikare is provided by Romaboo Ramblings, a YouTuber who focuses on Roman history. A Dispute Between a Man and His Ba is voiced by Clay and Papyrus, whose channel focuses on the history of the Hebrews and the Levant. And the Autobiography of Ankhtifi is voiced by Conventus Orbis, whose channel is about Middle Age Italy. Of special note, I'd like to especially thank Clay and Papyrus, who further provided historical works for me, which helped me greatly in making this video. And onwards to the New Kingdom.